The first light of dawn slipped through the pine needles like molten gold. The woods behind Ethan Cole's cabin were still dripping from last night's rain, every leaf shimmering under a blanket of fog. The only sounds were the creek whispering nearby and the low hum of cicadas stirring awake. Ethan sat on his porch steps, a steaming mug of coffee warming his calloused hands. He watched a hawk circle above the ridge, the same ridge his grandfather had hunted on, long before the roads and rooftops spread in from the city. For him, these mornings were sacred. The forest wasn't just land. It was family, memory, heartbeat. But then, that sound. A low rumble from the dirt road below, foreign, mechanical, out of rhythm with the wild. Ethan frowned, setting down his cup. The birds fell silent as a white SUV emerged through the mist, its polished frame gleaming like it didn't belong out here. Something told him this wasn't a friendly visit. The vehicle rolled to a halt near his fence line. The engine cut off, leaving an uneasy quiet. 3 people stepped out, crisp suits and shiny shoes, out of place among the mud and pine needles. The emblem on their SUV door read, Lakeside Community HOA. The woman in front led the way, mid-40s, hair pulled tight, clipboard hugged against her chest like a badge of authority. Her smile was polite but practiced, the kind that said, I'm not here to listen. Mr. Ethan Cole? She asked, though it wasn't really a question. That's right, Ethan replied, leaning on his fence post. I'm Marlene Grant, president of the Lakeside Homeowners Association, she began. We've received reports of gunfire near the residential boundary. HOA policy prohibits hunting in community areas. Ethan blinked once, steady. Then you might want to check your maps. This here isn't community land, and it's mine. Marlene's eyes narrowed slightly. Boundaries can change. Our new expansion includes this zone. Without asking? He asked quietly. She smiled, thin as wire. Our board doesn't need permission to protect community safety, and with that, she pressed a yellow envelope into his hand, a fine notice. The notice was heavy, printed with official seals, numbers, signatures. It accused Ethan of reckless discharge of a firearm within HOA boundaries. He looked up, the paper trembling slightly in the morning wind. You're fining me for hunting deer on my own property? Marlene shrugged, already turning back toward her SUV. You'll find the payment instructions on the back. Non-compliance may result in additional action. The SUV doors slammed shut. Gravel kicked up as they drove off, leaving a fading trail of dust and authority behind. Ethan stood there for a long while, the yellow slip crumpled in his hand, his jaw locked. The woods were quiet again, but the peace had been broken. He pinned the notice to the fence post. Staring at it like a scar, something inside him shifted. That evening, the fire crackled inside Ethan's cabin, throwing golden light across the old family photos on the mantel. His father's rifle hung above the fireplace, a reminder of simpler days when men worked hard, earned respect, and didn't need permission to live free. Ethan studied the fine notice again. The printed words felt sterile and cold, so unlike the soil outside, soil his family had bled for. His father's voice echoed in his memory. Son, land ain't about fences. It's about honor. You take care of it and it'll take care of you. Ethan exhaled slowly. Somewhere deep down he knew this wasn't about money. It was about dignity. The quiet kind that didn't shout, but refused to bow. He opened an old wooden chest and pulled out a faded map, drawn decades ago. The property lines stretched wide, untouched, clean. His name still marked the bottom corner in black ink. That was all the proof he needed. By morning, word had already spread through town. The HOA didn't just fine him. They posted it publicly on the community board at the general store. Violation of HOA Ordinance Number 47. Unauthorized hunting. People whispered as he walked by. Some nodded in sympathy. Others avoided his gaze. It wasn't just humiliation. It was betrayal. At the counter, old Mr. Harlan, the store owner, leaned close. They're overstepping, Ethan. You're not the first they've pushed too far. Last month, they fined a widow for hanging laundry on her porch. Ethan gave a small, humorless smile. Guess they're running out of laundry to police. When he returned home, the yellow notice fluttered in the wind. He didn't tear it down. He left it there, a warning flag of what was coming. That night, he unfolded the map again under the lamplight. His hand brushed across the ridges, tracing boundaries drawn by men who actually worked the earth, not ruled it from offices. He whispered to himself, "You want to play with borders? Let's see how good you are at reading them." The days that followed grew tense. HOA vehicles began to patrol the dirt roads, their tires crunching the gravel like a slow reminder of control. Ethan saw the unease spreading. Neighbors whispered about new rules: no fires after sunset, no sheds without approval, no disruptive outdoor activity. People began to fear letters more than storms. At the diner, Ethan overheard one conversation, an elderly couple talking quietly. "They fined us for planting sunflowers too close to the fence," the woman sighed. "It's getting out of hand." Ethan stirred his coffee, his expression unreadable. Beneath the calm, a thought began to form. Something daring, something precise. Late one night, rain hammered against his cabin roof. Ethan couldn't sleep. He wandered into his study and pulled open a drawer filled with property records, old deeds and survey maps left by his grandfather. As he sifted through the papers, one file caught his attention, labeled East Ridge Reserve Usage Rights. He opened it, brows lifting in disbelief. The document showed that the HOA's beloved hiking trails, the ones they proudly called their community nature preserve, didn't belong to them at all. It was unclaimed private land. The county had left. Ownership open due to a clerical oversight. Decades ago, Ethan's pulse quickened. The irony was too sharp to ignore. The same organization that fined him for his land had been trespassing on someone else's. He leaned back in his chair, letting out a slow exhale. His anger cooled, replaced by something far more dangerous: clarity. The next morning, the courthouse smelled of dust and forgotten arguments. Ethan stepped quietly through the marble hall, holding the old file like a secret. He approached the records counter where Mrs. Patterson, the county clerk, looked up from her paperwork. "Morning, Ethan," she greeted warmly. "Haven't seen you in a while?" "Morning," he replied. "I need to check Parcel 6B, the East Ridge Trail section." Her eyebrows lifted. "That old property? No one's touched it in decades." "Still available?" he asked. She flipped through the binder, then looked up with a faint smile. "It is. You thinking of buying it?" Ethan met her eyes, his voice calm. "I'm thinking it's time someone took care of it properly." As he signed the preliminary intent forms, thunder rolled faintly outside, the kind that announced change was coming. Ethan tucked the papers under his arm and stepped into the rain. His boots splashed through puddles as he walked toward his truck. Behind him, the courthouse doors closed softly, like the beginning of a storm. The rain had been falling for an hour, drumming softly against the windshield of Ethan's pickup as he wound down the narrow county road. His thoughts were quieter than the weather, but sharper, like steel being honed on stone. He had just left the courthouse, and the clerk's words still echoed in his head. "Technically, that land is still open for private purchase." Ethan gripped the steering wheel tighter. The irony of it all hit him in waves. The HOA had fined him, on his own ranch, for disturbing community tranquility while hunting. But the land they paraded around as their nature preserve? Not theirs, not even protected. They'd built trails, benches, and even a wooden gate, all under the illusion of ownership. But it was nothing more than borrowed earth waiting for the right signature. Ethan's lips curved into a quiet, knowing smile. "All right, then," he whispered to himself. "Let's see how you like playing by the rules." The headlights cut through the mist as his truck disappeared into the night, carrying with it the seed of a plan that would soon shake the entire lakeside community. The next morning, Ethan rose early. Dawn poured pale gold light across his kitchen floor, glinting off the stack of papers he'd laid out the night before. He sipped his coffee slowly, scanning every line one more time before folding the documents neatly and heading out. The courthouse loomed ahead, old brick, ivy climbing the sides, the flag above it rippling in the morning breeze. Inside, the air smelled faintly of paper and polish. "Back again, Mr. Cole?" the registrar asked kindly. She remembered him from the day before. Polite, quiet, a man of few words but clear purpose. "Just finishing what we started," Ethan said. He reviewed each form carefully, asked all the right questions, and paid every fee. The process was tedious, but Ethan moved with the patience of someone who had spent years fixing fences by hand. Slow, steady, exact. When the clerk stamped the final page and slid the folder across the counter, it felt heavier than it should. Official ownership papers for 40 acres of untouched woodland, the same land the HOA had been using for its hikes and photo ops. "Congratulations." "Mr. Cole," she said warmly. Ethan nodded, sliding the folder into his leather satchel. "Thank you. I think this'll clear a few things up around here." As he stepped outside, sunlight broke through the clouds for the first time all day, spilling across the courthouse steps like a quiet spotlight. By afternoon, it was official. The transaction cleared. The land was his. Ethan drove out to see it again, parking just shy of the trailhead the HOA loved so much. He stepped out and stood in silence, taking in the smell of pine and wet soil. The path wound gently between tall cedars, a breeze whispering through their branches. He walked slowly, the ground soft under his boots. Every bird call, every creak of the trees felt different now, as if the land itself was acknowledging its new keeper. At the center of the trail stood the old wooden sign, "Lakeside Community Nature Reserve, managed by the HOA." Ethan studied it for a long moment, then ran his hand over the cracked wood. He whispered, "Not anymore." The words weren't angry, just certain. A promise, not a threat. When he finally turned to leave, the sun was dipping low, painting the sky in streaks of gold and amber. Behind him, the sign swayed gently in the wind, as if bowing to its rightful owner. The next week felt eerily peaceful. The HOA continued their usual routines, morning jogs through the woods, family hikes, weekend meetups for community wellness. The group's social media page was full of smiling faces, selfies on the trails, and quotes about shared stewardship. Ethan watched quietly from afar. Some mornings he'd take his coffee to the edge of his ranch and watch them through the trees. It wasn't malice, he felt. It was a strange sort of curiosity. Seeing people so confidently walk across land they didn't own. It reminded him of how fragile control really was, how quickly people built authority on illusions. He spent those quiet days preparing, measuring boundaries, confirming deeds, making sure every corner of his new property was legally sealed and documented. When the time came to act, there would be no loopholes, no debates, just truth. One foggy Sunday morning, Ethan loaded his truck with several freshly painted signs and a box of sturdy wooden stakes. He parked by the trailhead just after sunrise. The mist hung low, turning the forest silver. He worked in silence, his hammer tapping rhythmically against the cool air. By the time the sun burned through the fog, 4 new signs stood proudly at every entrance. Private property. No trespassing without owner's permission. He stepped back, admiring the simplicity. No anger, no explanations, just truth on wood. Later that afternoon, hikers began to notice. Confusion turned into speculation. Group chats buzzed. Who put up those signs? Did someone sell the land? Is it a prank? By evening, the HOA board members were swamped with messages. Marlene's phone never stopped ringing. Ethan didn't answer a single one. He just sat on his porch, watching the sun set through the trees that were now, undeniably, his. The next morning, Ethan was repairing a fence when he heard tires crunching on gravel. 3 SUVs rolled up his driveway. At the front was Marlene, HOA president, clipboard queen, the same woman who fined him for hunting. She stepped out, perfectly dressed even on a Monday morning, her lips pressed into a thin, angry line. "Mr. Cole," she began, walking briskly toward him. "You can't just post those signs. That's community land. You're trespassing on property managed by the HOA. Ethan didn't even put down his hammer. You sure about that? He asked quietly. Her frown deepened. Of course. We've maintained those trails for years. Ethan finally turned, wiping his hands on a rag. Maintaining something doesn't mean you own it, he said evenly. Then, from his truck, he pulled a folder. The same one from the courthouse. He opened it slowly, letting the official seal glint in the sunlight. This says otherwise? Marlene's expression faltered. The air between them seemed to still. She snatched the papers and began reading, her eyes darting over the pages. The county's stamp. The signatures. The purchase date. Her confidence began to drain, replaced by disbelief. This must be a mistake, she said, her voice tightening. Ethan's calm never wavered. No mistake. Just good paperwork. You should try it sometime. Her assistants exchanged uneasy glances. They'd seen Marlene dominate every meeting, every argument, but now she looked small, her authority paper-thin. You can't block access, she said desperately. People rely on that trail. Ethan shrugged gently. Then they'll need to rely on permission, like I had to when you fined me for stepping on my own soil. He took the folder back, tucked it neatly under his arm, and turned toward his porch. Have a nice day, Marlene, he said softly, with genuine politeness. The 3 SUVs left in silence, leaving only a faint trail of dust and a woman who'd just realized her kingdom had cracks. That night, the HOA boardroom was packed, every chair filled, voices sharp and restless. The polished table gleamed under the overhead lights, but the mood was anything but composed. Marlene stood at the front, clutching a stack of notes, her usual confidence replaced by visible strain. There's been a misunderstanding, she began, forcing a smile. The land was sold without our knowledge. It's a temporary setback. A man from the back spoke up. We never owned that land, did we? The question sliced through the room. Silence followed. Another voice muttered, all these years, the trails, the events, and it wasn't even ours? The crowd erupted into hushed conversations. Some were angry, others embarrassed, a few almost amused. The once feared HOA board now looked like school children caught copying answers. Outside, rain began to fall again, tapping gently against the windows, as if the world itself was cleansing away years of arrogance and pretense. At home, Ethan sat by his fire watching the flames flicker across his papers, the deed resting neatly on the table beside him. He didn't smile. He didn't gloat. He just whispered to himself, balance restored. By midweek, word had spread through the entire neighborhood, coffee shop chatter, front porch whispers, text threads. All of Lakeside was buzzing with the same question. Did the HOA really lose the hiking land? Some residents were secretly thrilled. Years of fines, warnings, and rule letters had built quiet resentment toward Marlene's strict board. Others were confused. They'd believed the HOA owned everything within its gates. That illusion was shattered now. At the small grocery store near the lake, Ethan overheard 2 men talking near the counter. I heard the guy just bought the whole thing, one said. Good for him, the other replied. About time, someone stood up to them. Ethan paid for his supplies and left without a word, but a faint, knowing smile crossed his face. He didn't need to speak. The truth was speaking for him now. 2 days later, an envelope appeared in Ethan's mailbox, stamped neatly with the HOA's official seal. He stood by the mailbox for a long moment before opening it. Inside was a letter, printed in formal language but trembling with frustration between the lines. Mr. Cole, the HOA board requests a meeting to discuss mutual arrangements regarding land use and access rights. We believe a cooperative solution can be reached to preserve community harmony. At the bottom, Marlene's signature was penned sharply, a little too hard. As if the pen itself had felt her anger, Ethan folded the letter slowly, then looked out toward the forest. The autumn wind rustled through the trees, calm, untouchable. He didn't reply right away. Some lessons, he thought, needed silence first. 3 days later, Ethan agreed to meet. The HOA's meeting room smelled of lemon polish and faint tension. Marlene sat at the head of the table again, posture stiff, her voice carefully measured. "Mr. Cole," she began, "we want to make a fair arrangement. The trails are an important part of this community's identity. Perhaps we can discuss leasing the land or forming a shared management plan?" Ethan leaned back slightly, calm and unreadable. "Leasing," he repeated. "Interesting offer, considering I wasn't invited to use it when you thought it was yours." Her cheeks colored slightly. "That was a misunderstanding." "Sure," he said quietly. "And this feels like another one." The room fell still. Ethan's voice stayed steady, polite but impenetrable. "If people want to enjoy the woods, they can ask permission. Respect works both ways." He stood up, thanked them for their time, and left. The sound of his boots echoing against the polished floor like punctuation to an era ending. When the door closed behind Ethan, "The board erupted. 'This is your fault, Marlene,' one member snapped. 'You fined him, humiliated him, and now he owns half the forest.' Another added, 'Maybe it's time we step back. The HOA's been too controlling for years.' Marlene slammed her notebook shut. 'We're not backing down,' she hissed. 'He can't just cut us off from land we've maintained for a decade.' But even as she spoke, she saw it, the flicker of doubt in the other's eyes. For years, her voice had ruled every decision. But now it trembled. The room no longer echoed with agreement. It echoed with quiet rebellion. She felt something unfamiliar. Fear. That night, Ethan sat by his window, the soft sound of crickets outside. The deed folder rested on the table beside his lamp, but he wasn't looking at it. He was looking out into the dark tree line, the forest that had become the heart of this strange battle. He thought of his late father, who'd always said, "Land remembers who respects it." Ethan whispered those words again, quietly. He didn't hate the HOA, not even Marlene. What he hated was arrogance, the belief that control equaled ownership. That paper rules outweighed honest work. The forest had chosen its side, he thought, and it wasn't the one with newsletters and fines. Within a week, the story reached beyond Lakeside. Local newspapers ran small features about a rancher reclaiming land from an HOA dispute. Suddenly, Ethan wasn't just a quiet man with a farm. He was a symbol of boundaries, of patience, of justice done politely. Neighbors began dropping by with handshakes, kind words, and baskets of baked goods. Some even asked if they could volunteer to help maintain the land his way. No rules, just respect. Ethan didn't want fame or followers, but he couldn't deny the warmth it brought. For the first time in years, the community wasn't talking about control. They were talking about fairness. At the next HOA meeting, the turnout was low. Half the board didn't show. Marlene sat at the long table alone, staring at the empty seats. Her reflection warped in the glossy surface. The printed agenda in front of her, Item 1, Trail Access Negotiations, felt hollow now. Her husband entered quietly and placed a cup of tea beside her. "Maybe it's time to let it go," he said softly. She didn't answer. She just stared out the window at the distant woods, that green line she used to claim as hers. Her voice, when it came, was barely a whisper. "It was supposed to be about community," he smiled gently. "Maybe it still can be, just not on your terms anymore." 2 weeks later, Ethan hosted a small gathering by the lake. He didn't invite the HOA, but word got around anyway. Dozens of neighbors came, bringing food, folding chairs, and warm laughter. Children ran along the shore, the smell of grilled corn and wood smoke filling the air. As dusk fell, someone asked Ethan if he'd ever reopen the trails. He thought for a long moment before answering. "Maybe," he said softly. "But this time, there won't be signs telling people what not to do. Just one, asking them to remember it's a gift, not a right." The crowd nodded quietly. Even Marlene, watching from a distance in her car, understood. The man she'd tried to fine into silence had restored something much greater than land. He'd restored humility. The moon rose over the trees that night, silver and serene, reflecting across the still lake. The same lake that now belonged, Finally, to someone who understood what ownership truly meant. Autumn melted into winter. The leaves along the coal preserve turned to shades of amber and rust, falling softly onto the forest floor like the closing pages of a long, restless chapter. Ethan walked the trails most mornings now, sometimes alone, sometimes passing neighbors who nodded politely or offered a grateful smile. The old tension was gone. The forest had become a bridge again. He'd noticed children collecting pine cones, an elderly couple taking slow, careful steps along the stream, or young hikers quietly reading the new sign at the entrance. Each sight filled him with a quiet satisfaction. Not pride, but peace. This wasn't about ownership anymore. It was about stewardship, the word his father had used. He understood it now in full. One cold morning, Ethan heard tires on the gravel driveway. A car stopped near his barn, and from it stepped Marlene, bundled in a wool coat, holding a tin box. He was surprised, but not unkind. "Morning," he greeted. She smiled. A real one this time, tired but genuine. "Morning, Ethan, I brought something." Inside the tin were old photographs, community events, trail cleanups, smiling faces from years past. "These used to hang in the HOA office," she said softly. "They should be here now. This is where they belong." Ethan looked at the photos. People he knew, some he didn't, all standing in the forest that was now his. "Thank you," he said, his voice low. Before she left, Marlene hesitated at the truck door. "You know," she said, "when you bought that land, I thought you wanted revenge. But I see now. You were giving everyone a second chance." Ethan smiled faintly. "We all needed one," he said. Snow began to fall that week, soft, silent, endless. The forest transformed under its white blanket, every branch glistening with frost. Ethan spent his days cutting firewood, fixing old sheds, and tending to his horses. One evening, he walked the trails again, now dusted with snow. He stopped by the main sign, "Coal Preserve, respect the land, respect each other," and brushed the snow from its edges. He noticed footprints, small ones, leading deeper into the woods. Families no doubt still visiting despite the cold. He smiled. Even in winter, the land breathed life. The HOA had tried to claim control. But the land didn't need control, it needed care. And now it had it. By spring, the entire town had changed. Without the HOA's tight grip, something unexpected happened. People started helping each other again. Neighbors repaired fences together, shared tools, and planted gardens along the lake. The town council created a small community board for maintenance, but it wasn't about rules, it was about respect. The coal preserve became a symbol, featured in local magazines, praised as a model of community cooperation through humility. Ethan never gave speeches. He just showed up, quietly, to trim branches, clear paths, or guide volunteers through safety checks. When reporters tried to interview him, he'd simply say, "The land speaks for itself," and it did. Every rustle of the trees told the story better than words ever could. One day, a group of volunteers, mostly teenagers, built a small wooden bench near the stream at the heart of the preserve. When Ethan passed by, he noticed a small brass plaque on it. It read, "For those who choose patience over pride." He stood there for a long time, his reflection rippling faintly in the clear water below. It wasn't about him. It was about the principle, the quiet endurance that had changed everything without shouting, without anger. He sat down on the bench, feeling the cool breeze brush against his face, and let the sound of the water fill the silence. Months later, Ethan heard that Marlene was moving away, retiring, selling her home, heading north to live near her daughter. The news didn't bring satisfaction, just reflection. On her last day, she stopped by once more, not to talk, but simply to walk. She walked the trail alone, her shoes crunching softly against the gravel until she reached the bench by the stream. There, she left a single folded note tucked under a stone. Ethan found it days later. It read, "Thank you for teaching me the difference between owning and belonging." He didn't keep the note. He left it there, beneath the stone, letting the forest keep it. Years passed quietly. The HOA dissolved completely. The coal preserve grew, slowly expanding as Ethan bought small connecting plots. Linking streams and ridges together into one natural sanctuary, children who once played there grew up and brought their own kids back, telling them stories about the man who turned an HOA fine into a forest. Teachers brought students for field trips. Artists painted it. Couples took wedding photos beneath its trees. Ethan never sought recognition, but his name became part of the town's quiet folklore, a living lesson about patience, justice, and respect. Years later, on a calm summer evening, Ethan took his last long walk through the forest he'd reclaimed. The air was golden with the setting sun, and the trees swayed gently in the warm wind. He followed the trail he knew by heart, past the sign, down the slope, across the stream to the bench with the brass plaque. He sat there as light danced across the water, the forest alive with birdsong. This land, once a battleground of pride, was now a sanctuary of peace, not because of ownership, but because of understanding. As the sun dipped below the horizon, Ethan whispered the same words his father had told him long ago. Take care of the land, and it'll take care of you. The forest rustled softly in reply, a language only those who truly listened could ever understand. And as the sky faded to dusk, the coal preserve stood eternal, a reminder that the quietest victories last the longest. Days passed after the lakeside gathering, and for the first time in years, Lakeside Village was quiet. No HOA newsletters, no warnings pinned to doors, no early morning patrols checking compliance. The silence felt healing. Ethan spent his mornings mending fences, tending to his horses, and walking the edges of his forest. The trail signs still stood, crisp and bold, but no one dared to cross without asking anymore. Sometimes he'd see neighbors standing near the boundary, just looking in, admiring the woods from afar. They didn't need to enter. It was enough to know they finally respected the land and the man who owned it. But deep down, Ethan knew this calm wouldn't last forever. Marlene was quiet, too quiet, and when pride went silent, it usually meant it was planning something. At the next county audit, things started to unravel. A state compliance officer arrived to review the HOA's records, routine at first glance. But when she began asking about trail maintenance funds, things turned awkward. Can you provide ownership verification for the parcels marked Lakeside Community Trail? She asked, flipping through papers. Marlene froze. Well, technically, the land was... The officer cut her off gently. Legally, you had no claim to it. That's a problem. Within hours, it was clear the HOA had been using association dues to maintain property they didn't own. It wasn't criminal, but it was sloppy. The county would require a restructuring, maybe even a new board election. When word reached Ethan, he didn't celebrate. He just stood on his porch, watching the sunset blaze through the tree line. Justice, he thought, didn't always arrive with noise. Sometimes it came in silence, paperwork, patience, and truth. That night, Marlene sat alone in her office, surrounded by half-empty binders and fading plaques. The Community Excellence Award from 3 years ago stared down at her from the wall, mocking her. She opened her laptop and scrolled through old HOA newsletters, photos of smiling neighbors, volunteer events, quotes about unity and cooperation. She had meant well once. She really had. But somewhere along the way, rules had replaced relationships. Pride had become policy. For the first time, she realized she hadn't lost to Ethan. She'd lost to herself. She turned off the light and sat in the dark, listening to the quiet outside. The crickets, the faint rustle of trees, sounds she hadn't noticed in years. They weren't her sounds to control. They never were. The next morning, Marlene showed up at Ethan's ranch gate, not with her usual clipboard, but with a folded letter in her hand. Ethan spotted her from the porch and walked down, cautious but calm. "I didn't come to argue," she said softly. "I came to ask for something." He waited, Would you consider reopening the trails? Maybe as a nature preserve? No HOA control, no rules, just something for the town to share. Ethan studied her face. The sharpness that once defined her tone was gone. In its place was fatigue and sincerity. After a long pause, he nodded slightly. I'll think about it. That was all. No promises, no conditions. Just a sliver of grace, the kind that rebuilds things more surely than force ever could. For the next few days, Ethan thought deeply about her request. He walked the trails at dawn, listening to the forest wake, the rustle of squirrels, the gentle flap of wings, the smell of damp soil. Every sound felt alive again. He remembered what his father used to say. Land doesn't belong to you. You belong to it, as long as you care for it right. He realized then that closing the trails forever wasn't justice. It was isolation. The HOA had divided people long enough. Maybe the land could unite them again, under the right terms. That night, he pulled out a blank wooden board and began painting. The letters were slow, careful, and meaningful. By morning, a new sign stood at the trailhead. Welcome to Coal Preserve. Respect the land, respect each other. No HOA name. No fine print. Just principle. When word spread about the new sign, people came, slowly, respectfully. Families walked the trails again, but this time there was no entitlement, no loud voices or litter. Parents taught their kids to stay on the paths. Joggers greeted Ethan when they saw him working nearby. Marlene even visited one afternoon quietly, standing at the edge of the trail without speaking. She smiled faintly when she saw the sign, humble and unadorned, yet more meaningful than any banner she'd ever hung. It was as if the land itself had forgiven everyone, not through ownership or punishment, but through balance. Ethan watched from afar, arms crossed, the breeze moving gently through the leaves. This was what it was always meant to be. Weeks later, the HOA gathered for what would be their final meeting under Marlene's leadership. The atmosphere was somber but civil. She stood before the group, papers in hand. "It's time for me to step down," she said quietly. "We've done good things and made mistakes, but community should never feel like control. It should feel like trust." The room was silent for a moment. Then someone started clapping, softly at first, then joined by others. It wasn't mockery. It was respect. Marlene looked relieved, maybe for the first time in years. The weight she'd carried, the one built on perfection and authority, finally lifted. A week later, Ethan received another letter, this time handwritten. "Ethan, thank you for reminding me what stewardship really means. The community is learning, and so am I. I hope someday when you walk the trails, you'll remember that you didn't just reclaim land, you reclaimed respect for it." "Marlene," Ethan folded the note carefully and placed it inside the deed folder. Then he went out to the porch, coffee in hand. Watching the golden morning light spill through the trees, the forest looked the same, yet everything had changed. It wasn't about winning anymore. It was about peace. And finally, both the land and the people who walked it had found their share of it.